So, welcome Anisha to the show. Today we have Anisha. She grew up, growing up, she lived in Thailand and all over the US and spent summers in India. While she had incredible cultural exposure, she also saw a lot of the psychological, economical, and social challenges present in various societies. Today, as a South Asian R&B singer, she is dedicated to help address these issues. Welcome, Anisha, to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about your story and what. And you're an Indian and you're an
Mhm.
R&B singer. I'm really curious how that happened. How is that even possible?
So, like you introduced, I've lived in a lot of different communities, and always sang, but I think, as a lot of Indians and Indian Americans can relate to, you typically, and also the immigrant experience, it's built around security. And so I kind of went on the more conventional path of going to a good college, and I studied business, and then I worked as a software engineer at Apple Music. And I always loved singing, but I thought that Apple Music working there would be as close as I would get to music. Um, but at the same time, I always have been very interested in social justice issues. And when I was in college, I'd always been curious about a lot of the conditions in the U.S. Because even I had worked more in developing countries, like fundraising or visiting orphanages, things like that. But in America, you have a lot of you obviously have disparity, but there's also disproportionate number of black people, black men in jail. There's very huge range of school experiences for youth and opportunities. So I became interested in that, and I took my first Black Studies class when I was 21, and I'm 25 now. So those classes, it was startling, and it was very humbling, realizing even though I considered myself really active in these issues, that I knew next to nothing about the real history of America. And I think that we're taught a very surface level version of slavery, and it's taught very separate from the actual impact. And we're not really taught, you had slavery, you had Jim Crow, and like separate but equal, and then you had segregation, and then you had the war on drugs, and then we're just living, and people really disconnect that recent past and that continuous chain of events from the present. So all of that to say, that just opened up a whole new world to me. And I also started thinking a lot about, I'm Indian. I've seen a lot of these dynamics in my own culture, colorism, just internal biases that are so insidious, people don't even realize what they're saying. My grandmother was married at 16, so it's understandable, but she'd be watching a TV show and she's like, oh, she's so pretty, but she's dark. So a lot of these elements were there in India. And so, yeah, so I became very interested, and for the last 4 to 5 years, I've read a lot on the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, on um, post-colonial movements in South Africa, in Central Africa. So, and then recently I've started reading a lot more about India, and it's more difficult to find literature on that. But as I've started to read, I see a lot of connections. Ultimately, most countries have been affected by forces of, colonization, exploitative capitalism, and, like corporate greed. So there's a lot of those connections. And then lastly, with my music, when I was at Apple Music, I met a lot of rappers, and it was very serendipitous. And I started recording, and I was like, this is my dream career. This is why I did not like software engineering. Um, yeah, so I did that in the Bay Area, and there's a huge activist spirit there. And I mainly work with Black artists, Black audio engineers. So I've gotten to really see firsthand a lot of the impact of things like gentrification, police profiling, a lot of that. And so it's really motivated me to dive deeper, and I'm really trying to link my music with that activism. So that's kind of how everything has led to here.
It's a great trajectory, and not many people, especially coming from India, kind of do whatever you're doing, which is activism, R&B, singing. So how supportive were your parents and family in your endeavors?
They're very supportive. I think that both of them came to study here, and had to work jobs, had tiny houses, everything, and they're both in science-based fields. But so they're very supportive. My dad actually used to record Hindu classical musicians when he went to school. He went to school in Benares. So they're always very supportive. I think that it was just a little bit of an adjustment to really see music as a viable career. Like my mom, until she was in the studio with me for the first time, she didn't like kind of get it, that I was, really serious about pursuing it. But as soon as she saw me, she was like, wow, this is professional. Like, I didn't really realize. And then they've been very supportive. Now, they're obviously like want to make sure that I have financial security and that I'm ready. But I think because I've gone to college, I've worked, they understand that I'll always be able to I'll find some way to take care of myself. So like I have the backup plans. So yeah, they're definitely very supportive. It's just very new. My cousins are, Oxford educated doctors and engineers, and my brother's in med school. So it's a little bit surprising, but my Indian family is so supportive, so supportive. And I use very colorful language in my music, but they're all my uncles, they listen to it and they comment, like, they'll say like F star exclamation point, like they won't say the word, but I'm like, God, you guys are very excited about this language.
Wow, that you have a unique Indian family. I don't think
I'm like,
not
where do
many
you guys
people.
think I learned this language from?
Right. So I also want to ask you a slightly uncomfortable question, at least to me. I don't
Sure.
even know if I can ask it correctly, but you also, in your post, you also talk about drugs. I would love to hear how what your relationship with drugs and again how
Yeah.
family perceives it.
So my parents, my mom's been very open with me. Like, obviously in Indian culture, there's certain things that are kind of difficult to talk about, but I think my generation with each generation there's more openness. But ever since I was very young, my mom was like, this is okay, this is okay, but don't do drugs. Like, that was like a mantra in my head. So, but our generation, I mean, it shocked me how rampant recreational drug use is, and not just weed, but cocaine, Molly, LSD. Like, it was really surprising to me, especially cocaine, because I'd always associated my brain cocaine equals addictive, and I was like, the first time you do it, you could become addicted and you'd ruin your life. So, but I think that actually, having my mom instill that in me was really helpful, because I would just say no, like it was just something I never really do. That being said, in college especially, like I would, socialize and go to parties, and there was like drinking, but I was never really that tempted, because I also felt like I think something that people don't always think about is that your mental state is delicate, and we don't really understand chemical balances. We don't know that. And I think drugs impact everybody differently, and it's so normalized and sometimes trivialized that I think people don't stop and think, like, this may be okay for this person, but this may have a really bad effect on my psychology. So I was always very cautious about that. But when I moved to California, weed is legal there, and there's dispensaries, so you can kind of make sure that it's safe. And it's funny, smoking weed there is like having coffee together. Like it is very much a part of the culture. So when I was there, you know, I started a little bit, and then when I started writing a lot of music, you know, that became much more regular. And there was one day around, I'd been there for a few months, and I realized like I can do this whenever I want. You know, it's so accessible. And so I never really drank. Like I don't really like that, but I loved it, and it became a really in the beginning it was kind of difficult sometimes for me to write music, and you know, I would switch from engineering problems all day to try to write music, and so it really helped me. And I'm a very spiritual person, and for me, I think weed has different effects for everybody. For some people, it calms them down, but for me, especially when I'd write music, it was almost like synesthesia. Like I would see visuals of what I was
Whoa.
singing, and it was just so beautiful, you know, and it was so humbling. And for me, the experience that weed, you know, has is like I feel that I'm able to see things kind of disconnected from structures, and I think that that's really important, especially when you think about things like racism and you think about things like oppression, because it's important for us to be able to just uncover all of those things and see the truth and see like the purity of what's going on, because the labels and the limited history we're taught, it can create a lot of mental confusion. So so it's actually been very positive for me, and my parents know that I do, and I think the fact that it's legal in California is makes a huge difference. But yeah, it's definitely also a huge part of like music culture, R&B, hip hop, you know, that's a big thing. But yeah, I definitely have, you know, the last year I've hardly smoked any weed at all. So I definitely am very comfortable writing and things without that. But yeah, weed is the only thing that I would do. But if you think about in India, what is it like Bangladeshi? Like there's I think elements of marijuana or in a lot of different cultures. So
It
anyways.
is something. But you know, first of all, I have to tell you that's a brilliant explanation about what weed can do for you, and
And it's
probably I
definitely
have
different
to.
for everybody.
It is different from that. Yeah, that's loud and clear. And I heard this similar explanation from many people, including Steve Jobs, would talk about a similar experience.
Mm.
That makes me think. Now, I also transitioned from becoming an engineer to becoming a speaker, and sometimes I write speeches too. Maybe I'll take your advice and help me visualize
I think
things.
just people have to have respect for it. You know, I think that's the only thing because it's become so normalized. But for me, it's just become more and more salient. You know, especially like if you make a big life change or as you get older and more things open up and there's ambiguity. Like, you know, a lot of people and spoken about more. There's mental health struggles. You know, and I think that we just have to be so aware that you're being careful about not using drugs to cope or with escapism, and you just have to, you know, I just think we need to have respect for the fact that our mental states, like we're vulnerable that way, and it's just really important what we if we take like mind altering stuff. So yes, but to all the kids out there, don't do drugs unless it's
Yes.
legal.
Yes. Great. So let's go back to our main topic of the day, which is racism against India or Indians against racism. So tell me, before you got that education, right, in your school, and you learned about the slavery and the colonization,
Hmm.
were you racist?
So I think because I grew up in a lot of places, I wouldn't say like personal racism was necessarily an issue, but like I kind of told you a little bit before, I think this is part of the racial bias that we have. I was deeply, you know, glorifying Western culture, Eurocentric standards of beauty. Like I was terrified to wear my hair natural really until I was 23, and now I'm 25. And I, you know, grew up watching rom-coms with white actors and TV shows with white actors, and I definitely went through a stage where I was kind of like racist towards myself, you know. And there's a book called White Skin Black Mask. yeah, wait, am I messing that up? White. Anyways, it's by Frantz Fanon, and he's a really famous writer on like kind of the psychological impact of years of colonization, and it kind of just talks about how you end up, even people of color, you end up sort of kind of hating yourself or viewing yourself as inferior from things like intellectually to how you look. And so I think there was definitely that. I also think that, you know, even in progressive families, there's a lot of just kind of ignorance and just what we're taught, like the assumption that certain cultures are more educated and certain cultures are not. And I think, like, for example, it's like, oh, you can date a Nigerian because they have similar culture to Indian, but you can't date a, you know, X, you know? And I think that was something that is very rampant in Indian society. And it just kind of like, we have to just be aware of like stereotypes. I definitely think there was like, I stereotyped just in the sense of like, oh, you know, like white people are like Asians are more educated and there's like more crime in black communities. I think for me though, it was more observations of like what do we see, and I didn't really understand like why are these things happening, like why are you know black men in jail in a very disproportionate way. I didn't really understand why, and I didn't really question. So I think that was definitely there, but I think the biggest thing for me was just like glorifying white culture to the point that I wasn't even comfortable with myself. So yeah.
Yeah, glorifying white culture. Definitely, I also did the same thing because you know, growing up, we've been all taught like white is good, and the darker you're not good, right? So to be honest, right, you know, when I came to America, I had difficulty talking to any person who's even American, who's even Indian American, because I didn't
Yeah,
grow
it's
up
very
here.
different. It's very different. Yeah.
I didn't grow up here. I mean, I don't know what R&B means, what hip hop means. So, what is your suggestion if someone, uh, if an immigrant, and because we are specifically talking about Indians who comes to America and they feel they don't belong, and they're coming with all this baggage that you know you have to be white, you have to be westernized in order to feel like you belong. What suggestions would you give them?
So I think the first thing is, you know, as a community, like we've only immigrated, like, you know, I'm first generation born here. I only have one cousin that's second generation born here. So I think that we're still very new at like how do you honor your Indian culture but still balance, you know, being American. That being said, I have to say, and I was guilty of this, like I said, but I've noticed more so than East Asians, you know, Indian Americans, we really kind like we typically learn Bharatanatyam or learn classical singing, Carnatic music, but or dance, you know. But so we do those things. We go to pujas, but other than that, a lot of us act like we're white, you know. And I think there's like, you know, there's like a little bit of kind of not like superficial engagement with a culture, like you're kind of checking boxes. An interesting thing though is when I was in college, a lot of my Indian friends would kind of only hang out with like there's a huge Indian community, so that's there. But what I think, speaking about immigrants, is that we have to kind of start viewing immigrants as like bonding being Indian, not being so blatantly American, and then having this big contrast with our Indian peers. And I think part of that is, you know, if you think about Indian culture, it's very much about family. Like it's actually very balanced. Like you all have chai, you like, you know, you live your life. And I think that we need to start kind of bonding more, like celebrating things with Indians. I think even small things like me being in the recording studio, I should invite not just my Indian American friends, but I should bring my Indian friends. You know, I think it really has to be on the part of Indian Americans to welcome Indians into whatever they're doing. And I think we have things like sports, we have stuff like food, you know, we have stuff like music, dance, like we can bond over those things. We don't necessarily have to like go to football games, or you know, like we could do that, but I think that there are a lot of common things that we don't necessarily do. And the other thing is just empathy. You know, it is so difficult, right? Like moving here on your own, and you know, it is so rigorous to get an opportunity here. You don't have financial
Anisha, I think I lost you.
events where there are more actual immigrants there, and kind of integrating them into my life. I just think that Indian Americans need to be more active about how can we bring them into like the fun parts of our lives, you know? So
That's brilliantly said. I wish, you know, I had that kind of a platform when I first moved to America
what was
20
it
years
like
ago.
for you? You know, like how did you meet friends? Did you find yourself with more international students?
I was completely isolated for a long time. Of course, when I was at school, it wasn't a big deal because I had my Indian friends who also moved from India just like me.
Mm,
But after I was out of the college and I had to go for a job, that's when I was completely isolated because I can't talk to anyone else, and I feel, you know, I
mhm,
can't talk to Americans because I didn't feel I belong, and I didn't feel anyone was interested in talking to me, and I did not really have a platform. And also, when I would occasionally meet some Indian Americans, right? Of course, I used to feel some racism. It's basically because I already have some baggage in my head that I'm not good enough already. With that mindset,
mm,
I would approach someone. And I was casually speaking to this one gentleman one time, and we were having a really good conversation until the moment, you know, I asked some questions. We started talking about something, and I think I asked about what are sororities, right? I have no idea
yeah.
what those means. And those simple questions, I would not understand the terminology. So and then, oh, so you're from India. It was almost like, damn, you're
Yeah.
from India?
But I
And
think so
then,
much of Well, I
go
think
ahead.
so much of it is like Indian Americans. You're like, oh my God, I don't want to be called a nerd, and you grow up in these high schools where they're like, oh, Indians are nerds, like Indian girls are unattractive, blah blah blah. And so then I feel like it's like that sort of baggage where as soon as it's sad. Like you meet someone from India, and it's like you so want to disassociate with that label nerd that you're almost like, oh my God, let me run in the other direction. And that's one thing I really respect about the Black community is I know that there's maybe some people, I've heard at least, that there's not always as much integration between like African Americans and Africans. But I think if you look at least the Black community um, internally, and I have also heard there is aspects of like colorism or things like that. But you also see a really amazing sense of unity and like Black pride. And obviously that's come from decades of having to like unlearn things and speak up for themselves. But I think that's another thing is I think Indian Americans kind of have to lead that, and then that will open up the opportunities for people, you know, who are Indians who are coming in. But I really think there needs to be more like unity and celebration of like we're Indian and we respect and admire our Indian, you know, community. So yeah, but I really think that that fear of being labeled a nerd is so sad. It like makes us like shut out any association. But I mean, when you think about it, it is so badass that these young Indian youths, you know, without all the comforts and support of suburban America, you know, come here by themselves with very little money and just, you know, hustle their way through very difficult degrees. And I think that we need to really start like admiring that and celebrating that instead of like being embarrassed by it. But I'm so sorry you had to go through that. That's very
Uh,
isolating.
yeah, I mean, that's everyone's story, right? But it's so there is that's beautifully said. Whatever you just said is that Indian Americans can take some proactive initiatives in making them feel
Hmm.
welcome, right? Because they're, I think, you know, what Black Lives Matter has really exposed is two different things. There is certain things that the society can do for you, and also there are certain things that you can do for yourself. It's how you
Yeah.
perceive yourself, right? Like you
Yes.
shared with your
Yeah.
experience. You're while you were thinking highly of the white community, you're also judging yourself as probably a little inferior to others, and that's every Indian, right? We judge ourselves, and so that's something you can address within your mindset. But there's also some external support you could be getting if Indian Americans who already feel comfortable in their skin, who already know the history of slavery, and who already knows what it to be like in the shoes of these Indians who are just arriving, right? They can also take proactive initiatives that gives them a comfortable or a space for Indians who just arrived to freely express themselves and learn things. So I think that's a brilliant idea that you just suggested. I'm just excited about learning about it. Maybe we can do something around that as well. So you also touched upon how the economic differences in India. If someone is a servant in India, they are born, they probably are going to remain as a servant for the rest of their lives, and their kids are going to grow up as servants, and that's unlikely to change. What are some of your thoughts on how we can uplift such communities and help people gain awareness?
I mean, I think the first thing that I've been really disappointed about is apathy. You know, I think that a lot of wealthier Indians, they just don't care. And I think it's because they're so used to the status quo. So I think the first thing is just, as a younger generation, we can point out, you know, we can't help where we're born into. And is it really worth, you know, to have help cleaning our homes or not cooking? Is it really worth having these people trapped in, you know, cyclical situations? And the thing is, Indian poverty, as you know, it is disgraceful, you know, what goes on, and some communities, and so for me, I think one, people in India have to care because they have closest access. And like I told you with my grandmother, she gave what she could, you know, but by doing something simple like recording, you know, supporting
It's a
their
great
education.
story. Can I pause you? That's a great story, by the
Yeah,
way, if you don't
absolutely.
mind sharing them, because you haven't shared it live.
Oh, yeah. So I spent all my summers in Chennai, and you know, our help there, I don't even like calling them that. They're like family to me. You know, the person who cooks for us, you know, I call him Tata, which means grandfather, and he was cooking for my mother. Like, he is like super grumpy, and he would cook for us. And I remember we would touch down at the house from America, and we would run to the back and go hug him, and he would be like, ugh. Like, you know, so we have all these stories. So the mentality growing up was, this is your family, you know, don't view them as lesser than you. And then I think and then in turn though, because you give them that respect, I mean, he is so loyal to my grandparents, so loyal. And so I think the first step is having respect, like these are people. And then the second thing is empowerment doesn't have to be this grand thing. It doesn't have to be some big foundation. Really, the most effective empowerment will come from the people closest, you know. And if family is in India, so my grandmother, she would do what she could to support the education of all of the people that were involved in our household. So, for example, there was a woman named Usha who used to help kind of sweeping the house and cleaning the house. And ever since a young age, she would, you know, braid jasmine flowers in my hair. She would give me unsolicited advice, which every Indian woman does. And, you know, so she was really a part of the family. And I used to be sweeping with her, like probably making more of a mess. And so she was a really big figure in my life. My grandmother paid for her daughter's college tuition. I think it's called BCom. I'm not sure, but it was basically kind of like an MBA equivalent. And you know, the fees there are like a fraction of what you have here. Like the U.S. has some of the most ridiculous, you know, college tuition rates. So she paid for that, and then Usha, her mother, you know, living in government housing, has an abusive husband, like her son wasn't really helping with anything. And you have a lot of alcoholism and stuff like that, and the wives are just trapped in these situations with no prospects, like you said. But because my grandmother funded the daughter's education, she ended up going and getting a job at a tech company. And it was really a special moment that I'll remember forever and very emotional for me. She came to see me one day, and as like a gift for thanking my grandmother for what she done, she gave me a sari. And that was so symbolic. And I think really represents like, if we unite and do something simple for each other, it uplifts everybody. And the gratitude, India is very much a culture of, blessings is important, and you want people to bless you and your family and all of that. And so it's just a circle of positivity. And one thing as well is, in India, they have like the Dobie woman, and they help with laundry. And I mean, she literally lived in this tiny little stall right in front of the house. And, and even a small thing, like I remember I was a kid and they would see me and think I was cute. And they were like, "You want chai? Like, come here." So there was always that almost familial aspect. But my grandmother paid for her, I guess, undergrad or some kind of, not like higher ed, but, a step beyond secondary school. And she's literally used to sit with an oil lamp on the wall and do her homework, because they didn't have any running light. And I think the biggest thing to emphasize here is it doesn't take a lot. You don't have to go and sell your house or like sell all your jewelry and do all these dramatic things. I mean, forego a little bit of a luxury for like 6 months and you can really change someone's life. And the last thing I'll say, which is something that I really want to get involved in, and something that I am very openly and highly critical of, is corporations do not care enough and they don't do their homework. They have these huge corporate social responsibility divisions and they hire great people, but they don't do anything to actually take resources and empower local activists. And they go donate money to these big organizations that are also out of touch. So that's a huge thing. Because I worked at Apple Music.
Are you specifically referring to corporations in India or US?
I think both. I just think that I think U.S. corporations, especially with Indian CEOs, because a lot of the CEOs, I think, what's his name, Sundar Pichai, and you have people like that, who are not Indian Americans, they're Indians. I think that's the first and foremost, leaders that can change things, is they have access to capital that is unheard of, right? And I think that donating to the correct programs in India. So, for example, I used to volunteer with this organization in India where it was for children who were born HIV positive. In India, you have a lot of stigma, and the news will spread. And basically, these children that were born HIV positive in because of their parents, they were basically kicked out of the villages and their parents both died. They didn't have access to medication. So this man and then this British man partnered together, and they opened up, and they're beautiful homes, and they were treated with so much love. And so things like that, like I think it's, these companies, if they're going to donate, they need to take on the ethical responsibility of where should the money go. I think first and foremost, Indian leaders in the U.S. and then Indian American leaders in the U.S. And obviously India should be doing that, but I think it's going to take a lot more time to change that mindset in India. Also because, in India, everyone struggles to an extent. There's it's a completely different level when you talk about middle class in India versus middle class in the U.S. And think about this, like the talent coming from India with software engineers, like Silicon Valley is basically Indian. They serve coffee and chai at the cafeteria. But why is that? Why are those people not staying in India? And we may see changes with that, for example, as like with even COVID, people are maybe not going to stay in America as long, especially with the rent and then the isolation that you spoke of. So that may change. I just think that in India, it's going to take a while for people to even realize, hey, I should help, for the leaders to realize. But anyways, I really think that it has to come from Indian leaders in America, and then Indian American leaders. And one thing that I really want to do is, with my music, like as I get capital, I really want to make sure that I'm investing. So I want to do fusion music. And so even with just hiring producers, artists there, and trying to work with upcoming artists, dancers. So I think there's just a lot more that we can do. It just takes critical thinking and not just trying to check a box, you know. But I'm very active, I'm very vocal about this, so I can write, I can make a video, I can write about this. It makes me really upset how much money there is in the world and how little change there has been. So yes.
Yes, that's. I mean, I hear your energy. I think you'd be. I mean, you should check out her albums. Do you have any channel that you have that you can share your albums? That you share your
So
Instagram?
yeah, I can share the links with you. I mostly engage on Spotify right now. So that's, I'm on Spotify, Apple Music, SoundCloud, YouTube, but Spotify is my most popular one. But you can also follow me on Instagram, so I can give you that information. But yeah, I would
Maybe
love
we
to
can.
connect with people.
Maybe I can leave the information in the description of this podcast so they can connect with you. And thank you for being on the show, Anisha. It was really good talk, and one thing I got from it, one thing I'm inspired to do is I think people who are already aware of
Mm-hmm.
what's going on are the people who have to take initiatives, and that includes
Absolutely.
corporations in India. It includes
Absolutely.
Indian Americans who have experienced being an Indian and American. It could help India, and also the rich people in India who pays pennies to their servants. I mean,
Ambani.
yeah, I mean, they don't have to. They're not getting broke by sending a servant
Yeah.
to the school. I mean, these guys are making like $1 million, and they would pay their servant like $20. So
And that's why I think
of
it's the
course,
mentality, you know, it's just devaluing human life. So, yeah, but the
I
time is
think
now.
right. I think these are the people who first has to take steps,
Yes.
because people who are fearful, it's hard for them to speak up in unless a platform is clear. I mean, is created. So it's the people who have power, who have awareness, of the people who have to take steps. And thank you for doing
Mhm.
your part through your singing and all your initiatives. So
You as
thank you
well.
again for
Thank you
being on
so
the show.
much for having me.